All right, we are back and we're going to discuss today the CSS box model, which is a fundamental concept of CSS that you need to know. We're going to give you a little demo, and there's also some files up on D2L for you to practice with. All right, so what is the box model? All right, the box model basically is, think about this. Everything, every element that you have in HTML can be thought of as a box. So it can be thought of a box with content inside it, whether that's pictures, text, or a little of both. And then additionally, it has padding, which is space inside the box to create more space around your picture, like space between the edge of your box and the beginning of your text. That's padding. And a border, you can have a border or you can have no border. And you can also have margin. Margin is external. It creates more space outside the box. So here's how it looks. All right, so here's the box. So let's say this box is a div, or it could really be anything. Any tag in HTML can be a box, but the most common boxes are divs. So we have our content of the box. In between the content and the edge, we have padding. We can have a border or not, and then we can have a margin. So padding creates more space within the box, whereas margin creates more space between the box and everything else on the web page. All right, so in practice it looks like this. So for example, if this is an HTML5 layout. So we have our header here, which covers the entire space. And we have a section, which is floating left. In other words, it's aligning left. And then we have an aside, which is floating right or aligning right. And we have a footer, which is taking up the entire space. So the deal is that the CSS box model relies on percentages. So if I want something to take up the entire screen space, I make it 100% of the width of the screen. So in other words, I would say header width 100%. Okay, so let's say this takes up 60 and this takes up 40%. Everything has to add up to 100%. All right, the other thing about, and that's important, we'll see how that works in a minute. So any element can be pushed left or it can be pushed right. So elements can float left, and we saw that in our drop-down menu, or no, excuse me, in our horizontal menu. So in our horizontal menu, everything was floated left. So everything just snapped neatly to the left, and they, instead of being vertical, they wrapped around each other and they became horizontal. So everything was floated left. So elements, they float horizontally. So you can float stuff left or right, but you can't float stuff up or down. So a floated element will move as far to the left or the right as it can. And so let's take a look at that so that I'm not talking about, kind of talking in circles here. So let's just take a quick look at the float property. So float, in other words, alignment. So floats left, aligns to the left, right, aligns to the right. None, it does not float at all, or inherit, which we're not going to cover right now. So let's take a look at how this works. Okay, so here we have an example of floats. So we have some text in a box, and this is floating left, more text in a box, and this is floating left, and you'll notice that these take up 100% of the screen size plus a bit of margin. And then I have the second row of floats, which contains part 1, part 2, which has our kitty in it, and part 3. So let's take a look at how this looks in brackets. All right, so here's the HTML. Now, notice that I have a link to a style sheet in here. It's called styledivs.css, and this code is up on Dreamweaver as short examples with code, floats. And then I have these divs. So think about a div as a container that can hold anything. It's kind of like, think about a div as a box. It's a box that contains pictures, text, whatever, and you can float that box, size that box, and have padding and margin on that box. So here's the div. Hey, some text in a box. More text in a box. Now let's see how that looks in terms of the CSS. So I'm just going to open that file up real quick. Short examples with code and my styledivs.css file. I'm going to open that. Okay, so this is a very simple CSS file, and I'm introducing a new concept here. It's called the class. All right, so a class, let's go back to the HTML. Div, attribute of class, equals box. Okay, here we have styledivs.css, and a class is identified in the CSS file by a period. A class can apply to anything, so I could apply this CSS rule to whatever I wanted. And I just happen to be, don't overthink it for right now, I just happen to be applying it to a box. So notice I have a width of 46%. I set a fixed height for it. I don't really need to, but if I don't, look what happens. See? It shrinks to fit the, this is not necessarily a bad thing, you might want it, but it shrinks to fit the content. So I set a fixed width because I wanted my, my boxes to have a little bit of weight to them, a little bit of visual weight on the page. And notice my float. Floats to the left. And notice I'm using percentages for just about everything. So I have a width of 46% and a margin of 1%. I gave it a background color so you could see it. If I don't have a background color, let's take that out. Hey, look what happens. It's white. Can't see it. Okay, and then I also gave it some padding. So as we can see, this does not take up 100% of the screen width. And I gave the padding as pixels. I could use the padding as any value I wanted, because remember, padding is on the inside. So let's change this real quick to padding of 1%. Okay, so we still have space between the edge of the box and the beginning of the type. And I'm just going to move brackets out of the way here for a second. And you can see the CSS model box model in action here. So this is the box itself. This little tiny line represents the padding. Remember, that's inside the box. And the darker blue with the line around it represents the margin, or the space outside the box that separates the two boxes. So these both float left, and what happens is that they push down anything else. So to a point. Now watch what happens when I size this down. We're going to learn more about how to control this later. But when I size them down, they start to get all out of alignment. Now this is our first experience with floats, so we're going to worry about fixing floats and controlling floats in a lesson that is going to occur a little bit later. So I have my class for the box, and that applies to both of these. Text in a box. So I have my width of 46%, and that's big enough with the margin to push this down, that second row down. And now let's look at the second row, div class row 2. Second row, part 1, part 2, and then the second div or box has an image of our kitty cat. And the third has just some text in it. All right, so I wanted you to see how this works. So let's go back to, so visually we have 2 boxes up top, and then we have 3 boxes all floating left on the bottom, and the 2 boxes on top are big enough to push the second row down. So that's the name of the game. You make everything add up to 100% of your designated screen size, which we will control more later. Be patient. And then we have our second row, which has 3 boxes. They contain text, and one of them contains a picture. Now there's a lot more we can do, but all I want you to do right now is concentrate on getting floats to work. Okay, so let's look at the CSS, styledivs.css. Here's the class for the second row. The class is designated by a period, row 2. So it has a width of 29%. I did set a fixed height. It floats left, has a margin of 1%. background color of a little different, and remember the padding can be anything because the padding is inside the box. So I gave it a padding of 10 pixels. If I make it 1%, it's not going to change anything. It's not going to change my layout. Now if I changed the margin, look what happens. So it's all a matter of basically messing with the percentage values until I get a margin value that works. So right now I have a margin of 0. Here's a margin of 1%. But as soon as I go higher than 1%, they start to stack. So the name of the game is to take up 100% of the screen size, and then your floats will work. Okay, so this example is up on D2L for you to play with. The code is up there. The PowerPoint is up there. Let's talk a little bit about something else. Okay, so hopefully this is not too, I want you to experiment with this. I want you to take some time and experiment with all the different ways that you can float a box in CSS. And remember, float is just equivalent to alignment. And we've also introduced the concept of a class. So instead of redefining, now think about this. If I had redefined the div class, if I had redefined this div and just said, well, all divs will be 46%, that wouldn't allow me to have divs with different values, right? So remember, a class can be applied to anything. So I have two divs. One is identified by the class of box, which is 46% width, and one is identified by the class of row 2, which has a width of, I think, 29%? Yes, width of 29%. So a class is very versatile, and it will allow you to, I'm able to apply a different class to each set of divs in order for them to have different attributes. Okay, so let's give you a little bit more about floats. So we talked about float. You can float left, right, or none. I'm not going to worry about inherit right now. Okay, clearing floats. Now, we're not clearing floats in my little example right now. If you don't clear a float, then floats can occur on both sides. But if I clear a float left or right, it's going to push the next element down. All right, let's see how that works. So if I clear, let's get back to our example here. So if, let's say we're going to use the class of box, and let's say if I do clear, notice I'm going to clear it left. Hey, well, I cleared it left, so that means they're going into block format or vertical format. So they're not pushing everything down, and that's not what I want for this. So I'm going to remove that. And it would do the same thing here. Ladies and gentlemen, if you want to push something down to the next element, let's say I added a footer, I would create a different class that covered this very last box, and I would clear it so I would be sure that the next element pushed down underneath it. So we're going to learn more about that in a little bit. Let me give you, I'm going to get a little bit ahead of myself here, and I'm going to look at an example of floats in action. So we're actually going to do this in Dreamweaver in a little bit, but this is a series of images of jaguars. I'm sorry I didn't pick panthers. And they are all floating left, and they're in a nice image grid. So we're going to create an image grid in a different lesson. But this is a great example of how floats work. Watch what happens when I resize it. They all go down to block or vertical. So eventually we're going to learn to control, and this image actually, see the jaguar image here? It's responsive, it shrinks. We're going to learn how to control that so that we have a grid that's responsive and does what we want it to do. It stacks a certain way. But for right now, all I want you to do is practice floats. Get floats to work. All right, that's it for this lesson. You've got the files, you've got the PowerPoint. Go nuts and create some floats.